DEI? What is it not? And if you could elaborate on that also into why is it important today? What does it look like in 2022? Is that different than what it looked like in 2021? Yeah, just tell us everything.
It's that I literally listened to the questions. I was like, where do we start? So I'm happy to kick us off, and I'll pass the mic over to Rachel. But a lot of times when we think about DEI or diversity, equity, and inclusion, a lot of us might have different definitions, but we want to just take a moment to sort of define how we think about DEI. And I know some of you might have seen that acronym as like JEDEI, where the J stands for justice, or you might see a B in that acronym where the B stands for belonging and so forth. But really, how we think about it at SGO is diversity is really thinking about representation, right? Like who's represented and who's not as we think about our social identities, recognizing that all of our social identities aren't visible, right? And so a lot of times we talk about race, gender, but also disability, right? And ability and age and all these various things that make us who we are. And we get to this next part of inclusion, right? So a lot of times when we work with companies, folks are like, hey, we want diversity. And we always say, what kind of diversity? Be as specific as possible. But then also, if we're working towards diversity, such as gender diversity, race diversity, the next question is, do you have an inclusive space where folks will feel like, hey, in honor of all of my identities, I feel good. I feel welcome here, right? So that's the inclusion part. Do I feel valued? Do I feel like I'm part of this team or part of this company or outside of the workplace? Just do I feel good about being in my space, right? And then that last letter in the acronym is equity, as we think about, all right, we recognize that everyone isn't starting from the same playing field, right? And so how do we create and also provide support and resources so that people have and get what they need in order for them to be successful? So that's sort of how we think about those terms. Rachel, go for it.
That's a great overview of how we define DEI, right? But thinking about it's not just a one and done, right? You don't get a workshop or you don't, honor, the work one time and then it's just over with. This is something that's ongoing, almost into perpetuity. And I think if we think about that more of as opportunity to empower ourselves and our organizations as opposed to something we have to do, that really can change the way that you approach DEI work, right? Like, does everybody feel like this is a great place to work where they're included, they feel like they belong, that they are represented? And if not, how do we fix that? And how are we doing pulse checks along the way to make sure that we are remaining in alignment with the values that we have put into place? And how are we doing that continuously and making sure that we're still on the right track?
Love that. I love talking about how we have to make sure we're on the right track, and it includes regular check-ins. So that does bring us to 2022, right? What do things look like right now? Has it changed over the last couple of years? I feel like life as a whole has changed so much. I can't imagine that it's still in the same place, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's been a journey, right? We were talking about this earlier, Rachel and I, about even those of us who started being in DEI field before it was even called DEI work, right? Like I remember it just being called social justice work, right? And then we sort of labeled it DEI when we moved into the corporate space. And now over time, it's really hard to disassociate or negate what's happening in the real world. And generally speaking, that's always been the organic matter of DEI work. But there's been moments where we've separated the two, right? The personal and professional. And we all know that all those things are intricately linked, right? So as we think about DEI for 2022, for me, I can't help to continue thinking about like what's happening now, right? We're thinking about the pandemic. Folks are still doing hybrid workplaces or virtual workplaces, and we're thinking about who's being negatively impacted, right? And how are we showing up for our colleagues? How are we showing up for our employees by using that DEI lens that we just explained and defined? Another thing I'm thinking about is like, how do we prioritize DEI within our workplace, but then also in our personal lives, right? So we know, and we've been known this, but as time keeps going, we know that we can't say, okay, let's just go ahead and have a workshop and do nothing else, right? Or let's just go ahead and check off the box, because if we're not baking in DEI into our day-to-day practice, into our check-ins, like Rachel mentioned earlier, into our performance reviews, into, our strategic planning, then we're going to miss the mark, right? And so we're past due in terms of embedding DEI work into our workplaces. But I think if we're not doing it, especially in 2022, then we're in for some horror stories, right? Because we know that really what makes employees excited and engaged and wanting to be in the space is that they feel included and that they can come with their full selves.
Yeah, it's also important to look at all levels of your organization. So sometimes, you think on a corporate level, right? Did we do the workshops? Did we do the things? But then we look at how is the pandemic in particular impacting all of our employees. We understand that marginalized groups have suffered the most during the pandemic. And those are the people that tend to work, on the front lines in your grocery stores, at your gas stations and so forth, that may not have the opportunities to take time off or have the sick time. So how are you looking through the lens of diversity and equity and inclusion with your practices, saying we might need to reevaluate some of these things to support everybody at all levels so that the entire company as a whole is being valued and is benefiting from the practices that we're putting in place at the upper levels of the organization?